John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, while weep the sons of bondage whom he ventured all to save. But though he sleeps, his life was lost while struggling for the slave. His soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah.
Welcome to this special episode of War of the Rebellion, Stories of the Civil War. I am your host, Leon, and this is the first ever interview episode for War of the Rebellion. Simon & Schuster has generously sent me an advanced copy of the biography President Garfield from Radical to Unifier by C.W. Goodyear, which is out this July 4th. And we have Mr. Goodyear here today for an interview. Thank you, Charlie, for joining us. It is my absolute pleasure to have you on. Please tell us who you are, what you do, and maybe a little bit about yourself for our listeners.
Of course. Yeah, Leon, well, first, I just want to say the pleasure is honestly all mine. Getting a chance to speak to you and listeners like you, it's nice to be addressing people who are already experts in many parts of this topic. And let's see, I'm a biographer based in the Washington, D.C. area, which happens to be the perfect location for the type of books I like to write. And as for a little bit about myself, I'm originally from New Orleans, Louisiana, but I've done, as you can probably tell, a very good job of losing that accent. And so I don't know whether to my benefit or to my drawback, but so my roots are a little bit all over the place, but I always do like getting back there when I can.
Oh, man, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
So I have to absolutely know, what was the trigger that inspired you to write about President Garfield in the first place?
Yeah, well, it's no surprise that it was a very circuitous path, actually, to finding this figure from our nation's history. I think every historian and every biographer, in some way or another, either directly or indirectly, write about the times in which they're currently living. And so when I started the research for what would become this book, it was about 5 to 6 years ago, and I was very interested in finding a period of American history where the social, the political, the economic conditions were maybe somewhat comparable to our own today, but someone on the national stage of the United States was resisting the disruptive pressure of the times, and who was working very hard to keep the great system of government that we have, the great machine, I should say, functioning in defiance of these conditions around it. And so I was drawn to Reconstruction in the Gilded Age. You open an editorial these days, and I think more likely than not, you're going to find some columnist saying that, did you know that we're living through the second Gilded Age? And so that was a natural place to start from a historical perspective. And I was digging in the Library of Congress and through existing work on that time. And throughout pretty much every major event in that span of American history, so the post-Civil War and then the post-Civil War, which is quite an interesting narrative journey, I found the same person lurking in the background and foreground of pretty much every major event from mid-Civil War onward. And he was somebody who everybody on the scene in those times, regardless of their own politics, was saying vaguely nice things about, sometimes passive aggressively, but generally nice things about. And so that struck me as unusual. That struck me as odd. And the length of time in which this person was a relevant player and an influencer on the national stage was interesting to me. And that was James Garfield. That was a name that really stood out to me. I had read Candace Millard's book, Destiny of the Republic, about his assassination. But every time he was mentioned in the record, typically, it was always with the qualifier of future president would be assassinated in his first term. But that was enough to intrigue me. And then the deeper I dug into his life story, the more I was hooked by what I eventually pieced together to be maybe the most impressive personal rise to political power in certainly 19th century American history and maybe in American history overall. James Garfield was born in 1831 in a log cabin on the Western Reserve of Ohio. He was raised by a single mother, and he died holding the most powerful office on the continent. And he had been the youngest brigadier general in the American Civil War. He had been the youngest congressman in America halfway through the war. So he made an interesting transition there. And he became an incredibly influential and powerful figure in the Republican Party as it went through this complex and revolutionary and disappointing time following the Civil War, where you had the ups and downs of Reconstruction and the nice historical ambiguity of the Gilded Age. And I mean, it was an amazing narrative to dive deeper into. He was also a Supreme Court attorney while he was in Congress throughout that time. He authored an original proof of the Pythagorean theorem. He spoke several languages. And then, of course, that his style of politics was unusually compromising and conciliatory in that time. And that just struck me as a wonderful bundle of complexities. And so, I dove deeper into him. There's actually a quote about Garfield from another president, Rutherford Hayes. And, presidents don't often heap praise on one another. So I found this unusual. But Hayes wrote of Garfield during Garfield's presidential campaign, the truth is no man ever started so low who accomplished so much in all of our history. And so all of that combined made it obvious that this would be a compelling figure to write about.
Oh, wow. Just what a compelling story. That's amazing.
Yeah. And as I was going through it, I was pinching myself because I couldn't believe that from just a biographical standpoint, from a research and writing standpoint, I was like, this is perfect. This is a fantastic subject. It's as if somebody created this out of whole cloth for a historian to work through. And I counted myself lucky as being not the first by any means, but somebody who wanted to write this kind of book about this very interesting American.
Oh, and a seemingly great American after reading through your biography, that's for sure.
Well, I appreciate you reading it. It's a long one, but so kudos to you.
And it's worth it. And it's worth it.
Right.
Can you tell us about some of the obstacles you encountered writing this biography?
Yes, of course. There were many. And one of the ones that struck me immediately was the not the lack, but rather the abundance of research material. The Library of Congress has Garfield's papers on hand, and there are a few other Garfield-related resources throughout his home state of Ohio. And the challenge he was a hoarder. He was a prolific writer and a great intellect. And so his papers are remarkably comprehensive. You're talking about literally tens of thousands of documents and diary entries and letters and notes. And then so to navigate his own writings and then everything that everybody wrote about him, because again, his span of national political power, it ran from 1863 to 1881, the year he was shot. He was in Congress and then he was in the presidency. And so throughout that time, he had contact with pretty much every major political figure of that era, and everybody wrote about him. So to collate and wrap together all of this research material just from a personal perspective was very hard. There's that quote that Robert Caro gave about biographical research, which is the objective is to turn every page, to leave no historical document unread. Unfortunately, that was not quite possible with this. I'd still be in a library somewhere if I was trying to do that. And so the challenge was collating and piecing together this very complex life that often touched on many disciplines with which I was unfamiliar. Civil War, military tactics, Supreme Court practice, because he was a lawyer as well as a congressman. All of the different subjects that he was influential in that time, from spending policy in the U.S. federal government, because he was the chair of the Appropriations Committee in the House, which put him in control of the spending of the U.S. government, to census and statistics, because he was quite into the weeds on that type of policy as well. So I was personally constrained in trying to not only read everything, but to be able to contextualize everything in a way that I could do justice to the topic that Garfield was working on. And so that was hard, but I eventually there was light at the end of the tunnel, and I was able to get through it. Another big obstacle, this was an external pressure, was the pandemic. COVID was very disruptive from a research perspective. A lot of archives were shut down. And so my window of access to certain resources was limited. There was a short period of time in which I could really access everything. But fortunately, I was able to work around that. The archival staff at the Library of Congress in particular were very helpful. So I was able to retain digital access to a lot of Garfield's papers, and that helped supplement things when I went down the writing pathway, because in writing, you'll often have to go back to the source of your research, and being able to do that digitally while the world was shut down was very helpful. So there were a few twists and turns along this journey for sure.
Wow.
Yeah.
Especially, I can't imagine trying to, with so many museums and historical archives shut down, trying to write a biography. It's amazing that you were able to do it.
Oh, yeah. And well, I wasn't the only one. I want to give credit. There is a generation of authors and historical biographers who were grappling with the same subject. All credit is due, I think, to the library staff who were able to work through all of those things.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
So I was absolutely stunned at the mountain of sources that you used to compile this. Can you walk us through the process you went through of piecing together President Garfield's life into a cohesive story?
Yes. There was a period of about 2 to 2.5 years where all I was doing, just from a research perspective, was just going to archives and leafing through microfilm, physical documents, and everything I could within Garfield's papers themselves. And his papers are spread between the Library of Congress and then a few different sites in Ohio. So that the major source that I used for this work were original documents in archival collections. But again, his breadth of experience and exposure throughout this long stretch of American history meant that many other people had written on him, many of his contemporaries. So from the Civil War through to Reconstruction, and afterward, I was reading the memoirs of generals, congressmen, and pretty much every major political figure of that period, because they all had something to say about Garfield. That was something that was very unique about his political nature, is that he was, by his election to the presidency, and actually this was the reason he was elected president, he was the last person in Washington that everybody could essentially stand to be in a room with. He was a remarkably friendly and approachable figure who absolutely despised partisanship. And from a historical perspective, that made it easy to find a lot of interesting writings about him. People thought of him as a great anomaly of that time, and they weren't quite sure what to make of his political nature. So I was spoiled for sources to dig into about this man. And then from a writing perspective, once I had all of those things collated, and once I had appropriate context on the twists and turns of his life, I was very interested in writing about his life in a way that was vivid. Because his life stretched from 1831 to 1881. So he witnessed and he was an excellent writer on a remarkably transformative and divisive period of American history. And but I find that there's a risk of that time, and maybe you feel the same way as a Civil War historian, that a lot of the drama of that time and a lot of the tumult is often lost in a bit of historical grayscale. People today don't seem to really fully appreciate the action and the drama and the relevance of the developments of that time in American history. So I very much wanted to put people in his bootstraps, or sorry, in his shoes. Not bootstraps. I wanted them by his side as he's growing up on the American frontier as this young, impoverished boy. I wanted them to be by his side as he's fighting on the battlefields of Shiloh and Chickamauga. I wanted them to hear, bullets whistling past his ears. I wanted them on the floor with him as the Reconstruction amendments are being passed, and then I wanted them to feel what it was like in the room when Garfield, as president, was trying to balance the factions of the Republican Party and who was trying to keep the peace on this very fragile political coalition he was managing, and then ultimately failing to do so. And there was precedent for that writing style in a lot of the books that I'd read before. And so what I found was, given the abundance of research material I had, and then the inspiration I had from other biographers still around today, and then also historically, I was able to try to make this as vibrant and compelling a tale as I think the facts and the truth of Garfield's life deserves. So together, that was a very fun journey, melding those things into this life.
Well, I can assure you, you absolutely succeeded.
Thank you.
I was enraptured from the very beginning all the way until the very end.
Yes. Yeah.
Which has a perfect segue into my next question, because I found it immensely satisfying to read the portions of Garfield's prose and poetry that you included in this biography. Has any of his writing, whether personal or public, stood out to you as you worked on this book?
Yeah, he was a remarkable writer. He was, I think, perhaps the greatest intellect to ever occupy the White House. And he was very good. He was incredibly logical. He had that half of his brain was very high functioning. Again, he wrote an original proof of the Pythagorean theorem in his free time as a congressman, which shows you how deep that side of his brain was. But as you point out, he was also a very eloquent person in touch with the humanities, the creative side of the brain. And you can see that in the variety of things he did through his career. By his late 20s, he was the president of a local college. He was a state senator in Ohio, and he was also a preacher, a very well-known preacher in his region of Ohio. And those subjects coalesce in very interesting ways throughout the rest of his life. He's able to imbue like religious fervor into his politics, and he's able to add that scholastic side of his personality into his political stylings as well. And so the result was that he was one of the greatest orators of his time, and also one of the great writers. And so what I liked about his writings, his speeches, his diary entries, was that there are these marvelous examples of eloquent, religious, and very prophetic progressivism. And I know that's a strange thing to point out, but the subtitle of my book is From Radical to Unifier. And so in the lead up to the Civil War, during the Civil War, and then afterward, he was on the cutting edge of the social upheaval of that time, and the movement in the Republican Party to not only free the slaves, but also establish equal racial rights in America. And so his writings from that time are these, it's this evangelical progressivism that really just stuck with me. And when you read about his vision for how America would follow this course that he was prescribing, you can't help but get excited about it. One of the pieces of his writings that really stuck with me was after the end of Reconstruction, when he was minority leader of the House. He'd witnessed the downfall of these policies and the reversal of these policies that he had once staked the future of America on. And so he was reduced in many ways to simply writing out his hope for the future of a more just and equal American society. And he's writing here about, and I'm about to give the quote to you, but he's writing here about the violence targeted against Black Americans in the South after the failure of Reconstruction. He's decrying it. And he writes, such a conflict will not only delay the restoration of national harmony, but it will inflict immeasurable injury upon the social and business prosperity of the South. Reviewing the elements of the larger problem, I do not doubt that enfranchisement will, in the long run, greatly promote the intellectual, moral, and industrial welfare of the Black race. And instead of imperiling our democratic institutions, will remove the greatest threat to them from existence. And that was a he wrote that in circa 1878, and talk about somebody who essentially called how the civil rights movement would progress, not in a positive way, as in this uprising will happen in future, but rather just the logic of universal enfranchisement in America, and how that's not a risk to our democracy, as a lot of people in that time were arguing. Garfield actually wrote that in rebuttal to another column that had appeared in the same publication. But actually, that universal enfranchisement and the extension of rights to all races of Americans would end up being remarkably constructive for our institutions in the future. And that was very interesting to me. Again, this was somebody who was born in a blue-collar background in poverty in rural Ohio, who nevertheless had this remarkably inclusive and optimistic vision for the future course of America, and how the transformations that he had been a part of, and then he had witnessed and possibly been negligent about the reversal of, how that would eventually redound to the nation's good. And so reading that, it gave me an appreciation for the fact that a lot of these debates that we have about today about the future of America and the complexity of its past, and whether our structure is flawed, those were happening very long ago in our history. This is nothing new, and Garfield was one of the great intellects on that front, I think. Another way his writing really stuck out to me, or at least his appreciation of writing, and this having read the book, is in 1878, he opened pretty much every day of his diary with a different Shakespearean quote.
Yeah.
And so as soon as I noticed that, it resulted in the easiest editorial decision I had to make, which was as soon as I realized that he did that, he was quoting Shakespeare as he was minority leader of the House, and he was trying to keep the Republican Party from fracturing. And he was pretty much the only person trying to do that by that point. I was like, well, I'm going to use these to headline my chapters. And that was something I made within a few days of finding that. And it was one of those things that held up towards the very end. So that was very fun. And that definitely stuck with me.
It's something I noticed right away. And
Yeah.
I really enjoyed. As I got closer to each chapter, I was excited to see which bit he had decided to write down in his journal.
Yes, because you can't help but try to put him on the couch a little bit. You can't help but trying to read his mind as he's quoting these dramatic literary moments of what he was thinking about when he picked that quote for that day.
Absolutely. And speaking of dramatic moments, we're going to go back in time a little bit here, back to the American Civil War. When I reached a point in your biography when then Colonel Garfield was going on campaign for the first time, I had to ask myself, as someone who grew up in a log cabin, how did he even prepare himself, having not been a military man? And in fact, it seemed like he actively disliked his fellow officers at the outset of the war, especially with some of his early criticism of McClellan that stood out to me as an example.
Right. Yes. Well, criticizing McClellan, that was a very popular activity, of course, in the Civil War. But yeah, no, it's a very interesting point. And it's, again, something I didn't really appreciate. You hear often today people pointing out how our political leaders, they've never really served in uniform or in battle. And you look at historical American presidents and they all seem to have military experience. Well, the truth is it was, I don't want to say easier, but back, of course, in the early days of American history, and as you know, in the Civil War, the U.S. it had a very small standing army. And so in times of existential conflict, the Union would turn to its citizenry for volunteer officers. And Garfield was one of these. He was one of these influential community men who, at the outbreak of this great existential conflict that was the Civil War, he saw both personal political opportunity in joining the Union Army, and he also believed in the cause of the war. He was by that point he was a radical Republican by that point, and so he believed, even though the Union was officially fighting this war for sovereignty, not for any social or slavery-related reasons, he believed that the war would eventually redound, as he put it, into the shape of slavery versus freedom, and that the world will so understand it. And he wanted to be part of this liberating Union Army, sweeping into the South and purging this evil from American society. And so he was in his early 30s, and he had decided, he was already a state senator, a preacher, and a president of a local college. So he had enough influence in his local community to round up enough volunteers to form his own regiment, and then be elected as its colonel, and then to lead it south. And he then became what I'd probably argue to be the typecast of a volunteer officer, where his politics and then his motivations for joining the Union Army were immediately suspect to everybody else, all the professional officers in the Union Army. And as professional officers will tell you today in our military, the last thing they want is somebody who brings their politics into a battle zone. And Garfield and many other volunteer officers of his time, they had absolutely no problem with bringing their politics into a battle zone. So Garfield was somebody who, throughout his experience in the Army, and as he ended up actually being rather successful as an officer, he was constantly agitating against what he perceived to be the professional West Point establishment, who he thought were either sympathetic to the South or uncaring about slavery, or too risk averse to aggressively confront the Southern military and the Southern people and to conduct total war, as Garfield envisioned was necessary in order to properly punish the South and suppress this rebellion. He even wrote, as I'm sure you remember from the book, that when the war started looking poor for the Union in late 1862, he wrote, "If the Union goes down, let its eulogy be died of West Point." So he was an agitator. He was very frustrated as a radical that the Union Army was actually preserving the institution of slavery in a lot of the areas that it went into. He has this heartbreaking anecdote about being, I believe, in Alabama, in his column passing these plantations and these slaves running out of the fields to join what the slaves believe to be a liberating Union Army. And instead, he witnesses other officers pointing the slaves back at gunpoint back to their fields. And so Garfield, he's brokenhearted by the way that the war is being fought, and he's blaming the professional Army cadre for everything that's socially, politically, militarily wrong with the war by that point. And it actually ended up being one of the motivations for him going into Congress, and he had others, of course. As a matter of fact, he later made it a point of pride. He would boast in Congress that he was the first general in the Union Army to refuse an order to turn over a runaway slave that had hidden in his camp. So he did actively dislike many of his fellow officers. He disliked the style of the war that was being fought, and he blamed part of that on Lincoln, but a lot of it fell on the officer class. And I should say that the feeling was mutual. The West Point officers, Garfield was successful as a military commander in a lot of situations, but the professional officer cadre, when you read their letters about him, they see him as a politician first and a military officer second. And they were not entirely wrong with that judgment.
And certainly can grind on their gears when he is a successful politician general.
Yep. No, and I can totally sympathize. I think I can understand why that would be of immense frustration to them. Right.
Oh, yeah. Which brings us to our next question. As a podcaster and a podcast that specializes in regimental histories written by Civil War veterans, I particularly enjoyed your coverage of his campaign in Eastern Kentucky, which won Garfield his brigadier generalship. Has this campaign been studied in detail? Did you get a chance to study it? And do you have any recommendations on the topic?
Yeah, it was this very interesting. It was this. Garfield must have had, I don't know, a four-leaf clover in his shoes at many periods of his life, because the campaign that he led in Eastern Kentucky as a freshman Army officer, as a colonel with no battlefield experience, and the success that he had in that almost forgotten field of the war, that ended up being crucial to his rise in the military ranks. You mentioned that it made him a general, the youngest general in the Army. And it also was very important to his national stature, because at this point in the war, this was when Don Carlos Buell was stuck in North Kentucky, and the Union Army, kind of across all fronts, was being perceived as stolid, slow, lackluster, hesitant to bring the fight to these major Southern armies that were campaigning. And when Garfield arrived in camp with his volunteer regiment as a volunteer officer, no other members of that command he was joining, no other officers of his rank or above, wanted this assignment that had been thrown down the command pipeline, which was to go to East Kentucky and to clear its hills and its snowy crevasses and river valleys of this small force of rebels that were kind of roving and raiding through the area. So he got basically handed this almost throwaway assignment that none of his peers wanted. And he ended up winning great glory in this, because by virtue of relatively little action going on in other parts of the war front by that point, when Garfield ended up being successful in turning away what ended up actually being a pretty pathetic rebel force through these valleys of East Kentucky, he won great glory, because the Union press were looking for good news to report. And the idea of this young preacher, scholar, state politician kind of striding out into this corner of the battlefield and sweeping an eastern wing of the state of rebels, that won him great, and I'd argue disproportionate glory, because it was a small rebel force. The casualties were relatively low. But it was very interesting to study, and it has been studied in detail, I should say. The Sandy Valley campaign, which is what it was called, has been studied by scholars who are interested in Brigadier General Humphrey Marshall, who is the rebel commander of that rebel force, and then scholars of Garfield, because this was such an important point in his own career. So a lot of people had followed the twists and turns of this very circuitous, strange campaign in this, pretty wild corner of America at that time. And when you read the diary entries of Garfield's soldiers and that of the rebels of that time, you get the sense of this snowy bushwhack that just seems that's very interesting to read about, the misery of both sides and the intrepid nature of the fighting they were doing. I very much enjoyed studying it. And as a matter of fact, one of my favorite things in my research experience was I actually went to these battlefields, and I was able to drive through these, windy corridors of East Kentucky, and I got tours of these fields. And that gave me a real appreciation for just how rugged of a campaign this was, and why, for good reason, many of Garfield's peers in the Union Army were hesitant to fight there. So that was fun to see at that time of year. All of the tactile feeling of fighting through those hills. That's something that visiting these sites can only give you.
Oh, absolutely amazing.
Mm.
So after he gets promoted to brigadier general, he goes to, I believe it's Washington, D.C.
Yes.
And he's trying to find a place of where he needs to go next. And he ends up being attached as chief of staff to General Rosecrans.
Mm.
And I have to ask, whose story of the Battle of Chickamauga do you personally believe? And can you tell us anything about the incident?
Yes, I can. And this is actually a very hard question. So for a bit of background context, Garfield had managed to, by virtue of his personal charm and his bond with General Rosecrans, he had Rosecrans being one of the major Union commanders by that point in the war, he had managed to secure a job as Rosecrans' chief of staff, and he had become essentially Rosecrans' right-hand man in the commanding of this vast Union army, the Army of the Cumberland. And in that role, he had gradually developed doubts about the capacity of Rosecrans to lead. The reason that Garfield had accepted the chief of staff role in the first place was because he thought Rosecrans was an exception to that West Point rule that I mentioned before. He thought that Rosecrans was this intrepid fighter who had turned back Braxton Bragg at the Battle of Stone River and who was on the verge of making this thrust into the Confederate heartland. Now, what eventually happened was Rosecrans, rather than continue in his campaign style that he had, in his reputation that he had built up to that point, he hunkered down in the town of Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And rather than continue his campaigning, he ended up shying away from combat and being very hesitant to move forward with his intrepid force. And Garfield had eventually soured on his commander. He was chief of staff to Rosecrans, but this didn't stop Garfield from beginning to undermine Rosecrans to Garfield's friends in Washington. Because Garfield, by this point, he had won a congressional race, so he was about to go into D.C., and into the Capitol building and to be part of the change he wanted to see in the way the Union was fighting this war. And he had made a lot of friends, even at the cabinet level of Washington at that time. So as Rosecrans hesitates, as political pressure builds on Rosecrans from above, from the administration, Garfield starts writing letters to Salmon Chase, to Edwin Stanton, that are that essentially say, I love Rosecrans as a person, phenomenal man. I disagree with the way he is leading this campaign now, and I want it to be clear that I'm trying to convince him to change his ways in camp, which is an insanely, I don't want to say seditious, but again, if I bring it back to the standards of a modern army, imagine the chief of staff of a four-star general today writing to cabinet level secretaries undermining his commander in a war zone. That would be an unprecedented breach of not only trust but military norms and all that things. And it reinforced this perception from the West Point class of officers that Garfield was. Now again, this was secret at that time, but it reinforced this perception that Garfield was a politician first and a general second. Now, eventually, of course, Rosecrans does pitch camp. He or pull up his stakes and head out, and he ends up routing Braxton Bragg all the way to Chattanooga, Tennessee. So he eventually does move, and the initial campaign that results, the Tullahoma campaign, is a smashing success. But ultimately, it was doomed in history in terms of national memory because it coincided with the Battle of Gettysburg and Grant's capture of Vicksburg. So unfortunately, the timing of Rosecrans' brilliant campaign made it less brilliant by relative comparison. And so that is all the lead up to the Battle of Chickamauga, in which Braxton Bragg's forces essentially bait Rosecrans and Garfield into this awful, turbulent mess of a conflict on the Tennessee-Georgia line. And in the chaos of this pseudo ambush, there is a sense that the Union lines are collapsing, and that the rebels are about to envelop Union forces and then move on and capture Chattanooga. And in the chaos of this fight, Rosecrans supposedly freezes. He supposedly stops and he becomes listless. He's robotic. He's unsure of how to respond. And in the midst of a panicked Union retreat, there is report that there is still fighting going on in part of the battlefield. So this is where the two stories diverge. Garfield and Rosecrans are on this road with these Union forces who are in flight against what seems to be a pretty unstoppable rebel advance. And Garfield's version of the tale is that he asks Rosecrans what to do about the reports of fighting still going on down the battle line. Rosecrans doesn't give any response, and then Garfield asks permission to go off, and Rosecrans does it. And then Garfield goes on this intrepid, pretty insane hell dash ride straight across the battlefield of Chickamauga on a horse, past rebels, through fighting, and he ends up reaching the position of General George Thomas, who turns back his wing, who turns back the wing of rebels that are attacking his position, and in so doing effectively saves Chattanooga from falling to the rebels. And that reputation, and that ended up making George Thomas's reputation. From then on, he was known as the Rock of Chickamauga because he refused to flee in the face of this rebel advance. Now, the opposite happened for Rosecrans, because Rosecrans was seen as this commanding officer who had fled the battlefield while battle was still going on. Rosecrans' version of events was that he asked Garfield to go to Chattanooga to secure the position, and that Rosecrans initially wanted to go see what was happening with George Thomas. Now, Rosecrans' version of events was that Garfield was the one who hesitated to go to Chattanooga, and so Rosecrans switched their assignments. And so those are the two stories. Which one I believe, I am not sure. This is one of those moments where I'm afraid I have reason to doubt the veracity of my subject, President Garfield, because by that point he was a political animal, and I'm inclined to believe that his version of events, where he was the one who suggested riding up to George Thomas and that he did that himself, would be true. I think in the ambiguity of that battle, though, and the fact that these two accounts have never really been resolved, it's hard for me to say the exact exchange that happened and who was responsible for that decision. Nevertheless, the image and the objective outcome of what happened from that conversation was pretty clear, and it was very damning for one in particular. Garfield rode through battle, dodging bullets and reaching this position, and ended up being a witness to the reversal of complete disaster for the Union. Whereas Rosecrans left the battlefield, and the visuals of that are very damning to Rosecrans. It ended up being the end of his career. Essentially, he became a villain of the Union war effort by that time. But what's very interesting, and this is where the story comes full circle, is that there are accounts that in the cabinet meeting after the disaster that was the Battle of Chickamauga, where the cabinet was trying to decide Rosecrans' fate, and everybody in that meeting was not saying nice things about Rosecrans. No one was coming from that with a positive impression of him. Lincoln said that Rosecrans had acted famously like a duck struck on the head in how he had left the field in a daze. But at the peak of this debate, Sam and Chase apparently produced a letter and read from it. And then he said, and the letter was condemning Rosecrans. And then he said at the very end, and Chase had this, he was very much he should have been an actor, really. He had a flair for the dramatic. And he said, and this letter was written by Rosecrans' professed friend and aide, James Garfield. And that ended up sealing the fate. So the way that played, that was a very famous case of politics and military action coinciding, and not entirely, I think, to Garfield's historical reputation, not in a way that benefits it.
Well, as we all know, being in the military and politics go hand in hand, whether West Pointers like it or not.
Yes.
And speaking of him becoming a political animal, what did you find compelling about your research with Garfield's election into the House of Representatives?
Yeah, what I found very compelling was how he was able to manage his election to the House of Representatives while serving in the military and while being very guarded about seeming like he wanted that promotion. As I mentioned before, Garfield's experience in the military had not endeared him to his peers in the service, and it had not endeared him to the style of war that was being fought. And he eventually decided that being in Congress, being in a political theater nationally, would help him be both of greater benefit to the Union war effort and in a more natural environment for him personally than continuing to fight in war. So, but the great challenge of that for him was that despite wanting to be in Congress, he was pathologically afraid of seeming like he wanted to be. He knew that by that point, to be a volunteer officer who then left the service to join Congress, that would kind of cement his public reputation as being somebody who only fought for the Union in order to better himself. And that, of course, wasn't true. He had joined the war effort in part to benefit himself politically, but he also believed in the cause, and he was a very effective fighter. And he ended up being of great help to the war effort in that front. But he nevertheless did have his own selfish reasons for going into politics from the armed services. So what happened was, and this was what very much interested me, was how he was able to, while in the armed services, coordinate a local political campaign back home, back in Ohio, while publicly appearing to deflect interest in this promotion and pretend like he didn't want this election to go his way. And some of it's very comical to read. The line that he kept on saying in case when friends were publicly asking was, if the people of their own will elect me, then I'll be forced to consider it. Whereas in private, when he's writing his friends, he's making it pretty clear that he would like them to campaign on his behalf. So the way he managed that was very interesting to me. And it culminated almost serendipitously. And I say almost because I can't quite be sure just how they arranged this. But Garfield happened to fall genuinely, verifiably, terribly sick right at the moment that there was a nominating convention for the congressional race back in his home district. And so he lost 30 pounds. He developed jaundice. He had to be carried into this court martial that he was presiding over on a sick bed. And right as that was happening, and right as he needed sick leave to go home, he was able to secure passage back home, where just within a couple of weeks, the nominating convention occurred. And he happened to spend his recuperation in a cabin just down the road from the town where the nominating convention was being held. And so he was able to demonstrate interest in this political race that he was publicly deflecting interest in at a time where the circumstances just happened to align. And that was, again, one of those moments as a biographer where you're wondering how he pulled that off from a circumstance perspective. So that there were times where I was just smiling to myself about how he was able to engineer that.
And that seemed to be a reoccurring theme for him in politics. He didn't want to have the perception that he deserved the position, but rather that his constituents needed to elect him into it.
Yes. And he was again pathologically afraid of that. And I think part of that was genuinely heartfelt. He would prefer in an ideal situation to not have to be this active politician. But he was also genuinely afraid. He knew to be careful with ambition. And he was, especially in his later congressional career, he was one of the very few people in Washington who had been around long enough to know this was true. But he knew that the presidency was often not very good for the people who ended up occupying it. And he was very afraid, and we'll get back to this later, I'm sure, of actually winning that job himself. He had genuine trepidation about being forced to inhabit a political role that would only bring him misery and reduce his productivity as a statesman. So it's a very interesting case of political psychology, I think.
Absolutely. And that's also something that is a reoccurring theme in your biography as well.
Yeah. And again, we'll get down to this later, but he was quite right to be afraid of the presidency. All of his trepidation, it ended up being poetically apt.
Yeah, as history has carried out for us, it's a lonely place to be.
Very much so.
And it would seem that I also have President Garfield to thank for my love of history and science and reading. As a boy, I spent many long hours in a public school library reading absolutely everything I could get my hands on. Could you tell us a little bit about Garfield's relationship to the Department of Education?
Yes, well, if you're reading everything you can get your hands on, I might say you have a lot in common with him. That's a nice comparison to have. Yeah, Garfield in his early congressional career ended up founding the first federal Department of Education, which is an interesting part of his political journey, his personal journey. But he ended up founding it with an idea to being part of a reconstruction effort, the reconstruction of the South. He decided, and other people were talking to him about this idea, but he ended up being the sponsor of it. He decided that in the aftermath of the Civil War, where throughout the South you had suddenly had 4 million new U.S. citizens in the form of former slaves, and in the Northeast, where you're having millions of immigrants pour in from Europe, he decided that the best way the U.S. could spend public money was to invest in the intelligence of its citizens and to ensure that as they inherited their democratic rights, they would know to use that responsibly. So he has this great line of, shall we expand the boundaries of citizenship and make no provision to increase the intelligence of the citizen? So he decided that a federal authority, not as we understand it today, but a federal authority to support the development of education systems in the states would be a very valuable way to spend the public money. And he ended up being successful, at least initially, in creating that entity. Now, that ended up being quite somewhat of a star-crossed enterprise. The first federal Department of Education was not a success story. Its power was relatively limited, and Garfield didn't want it to exceed that power. And not only that, there were a few errors of leadership in this new wing of the federal government. And so eventually, but Garfield was its reliable ally through the years. He defended it when other congressmen were trying to take appropriations from it. He also defended it against very racist attacks. The Democrats of that day saw the Department of Education as being an attempt by the Republican Party to buy the votes of African Americans, and they argued that it was a conspiracy to. I don't want to go down that road, but the attacks that Garfield had to fend off to protect this creation of his were remarkable, and he ended up being partially successful. His power alone preserved it as an institution, but it nevertheless got busted down eventually from being a department to a bureau, and it got absorbed into another office of the Department of the Interior. But there are many things about Garfield's legacy as a really important and impressive American statesman that have been forgotten. And one of them is his role as a forefather of American public education. And so I'm in the DC area. I would like one day to talk to somebody at the Department of Education about maybe getting a statue put up. but right now he's one of those forgotten ancestors of that wing of American government.
Yeah. Well, as someone out here in Western Washington, my fiance went to a President James Garfield High School.
There you go.
His scope has certainly reached all corners of America, from corner to corner.
Oh gosh, yeah. His legacy is everywhere. The amount of things named after him is strange. There are 2 Mount Garfields in America, which I found kind of interesting. Not only that, high schools, a lot of high schools, a lot of hospitals, roads, and even entire cities. There's a city in Kansas, Garfield, Kansas, that I've emailed with and they were founded after James Garfield. Because I found a letter in his papers that was addressed to this place. And what had happened was some of his constituents had moved to Kansas and decided to name their new settlement after. So that was kind of interesting. And also, Johnny Cash wrote a song about him, which was interesting. And not only that, the cartoon cat was indirectly named after him, because so many people named their children after James Garfield. I meet them on a weekly basis when I tell them about my book. And the cartoonist, one of the cartoonist relatives, was named after Garfield. And so when the cartoonist had to name his creation, he named it after his relative. So it's this indirect connection. But yeah, no, the way he pops up, it's an amazing intersection of all these historical strands.
Oh, that's just great.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I noticed in your biography and I found this absolutely remarkable, was that when then Representative Garfield went to Great Britain, he noted that the brick sizes were different.
Hmm.
Who notices that kind of minute details?
Somebody who is just such a strong intellect and who gets excited about these very strange things. It goes to show his obsession with detail. By that point in his congressional career, he was starting to move off of Reconstruction policy, and he was entering what he called the constructive period of Republican government. He was starting to pivot away from these divisive and politically costly social issues, and he was moving into things like fiscal policy, census policy, and he was getting obsessed with these dry details, and he became known as the great policy wonk of the House in that time. And when he lands in Britain after this, transatlantic voyage, he gets off in Liverpool, and he immediately he gets hooked up. He's taking in all aspects of the society that he can, and he gets hooked on the sizes of the bricks, which is, it just goes to show you how obsessed he is with details. But that trip was very interesting to me when I was reading about it in his letters, because it gave him a chance as this, again, he had been raised in a single parent household in a log cabin in Ohio. And then as this Republican congressman, he goes on a journey with himself and his wife to Britain, and he's invited into the Houses of Parliament, and he gets to be present for all of these debates. And what he writes home is this great meditation on how proud he is to be an American, and how happy he is that his sons are in a land where their worth is determined not by their birth, but by the content of their character. And I just thought, in the way in which his massive intellect is engaging with, the foggy old England, and how he's thinking back to how thankful he is to be from a land where he could make himself into what he is. I just thought that was fun to pull on from a narrative perspective.
And it was a great narrative and an excellent part that makes American presidents, I think, more unique than people who rise to power in other countries around the world with maybe older established systems. Just great.
And he I couldn't agree more. And you can see that, by the way, we all acknowledge that as Americans in the way we tend to deify our presidents. There's no other country on the planet that puts its political leaders on the pedestals that we do. Not necessarily in a positive way, because not all of us like all of them. But we see so much significance in the people that we pick, and they've been men so far. I think that's going to change quite soon. But more than any other nation, we put these people under a microscope, and in them we try to see ourselves, and not just as individuals, but the values of our nation. And that's what makes it so fun, and what makes presidential biography such a unique literary entry, I think.
Well, can't go wrong there. So
no.
One of the things that is brought up in your book is the Electoral Count Act, and it was passed in 1887. How did Garfield influence its passage, even though it came after him?
Yes, it came long after his death, or at least 6 years after his death. But it had been based off of this remarkable election drama that had happened in 1876 and 1877. And that was, of course, the election of 1876, the presidential election, which has gone into the history books as the first disputed presidential election in American history. And what I mean by that is it's an election where, after the results have been tallied, half the country essentially rejects them and says that the results are fraudulent and threatens civil war in order to inaugurate the rightful president. And that was the Democratic Party of that time that was arguing that. And so back in that period, Garfield was kind of the leading member of the Republican House still left. And although he wasn't a candidate in that election, Rutherford Hayes was the candidate. Garfield ends up, by virtue of his unique place of authority, influence, and his political nature, he ends up being the person charged often with resolving what was then seen as an unprecedented presidential crisis in American history. So he goes to the states where the results are he goes to Louisiana, which is one of the states where the results are being disputed, and I'm from Louisiana, and he investigates reports of violence being targeted against Black voters there. He goes back to the House, which was controlled by Democrats of that time, in order to refute their allegations that the presidency was being stolen from them. He is drawn into these backroom negotiations. And again, this is unfolding over the period of about 5 to 6 months. It's between the election day and the inauguration. So it's this period of American history where everything seems up for grabs. This is a new uncharted. These are uncharted waters for the republic. One side is not respecting the results of an election, and for months the country was filled with talk and calls for civil war with one party, arguing for another secession and the other trying to hold the Union together and then making their counterpoints. So Garfield's drawn, as upon coming back to Washington, into all these backroom negotiations. And then simultaneously, he's appointed to the official Electoral Commission, which is a 15-person body made up of Supreme Court justices, senators, and congressmen, who are charged with essentially voting as a 15-person body with who won the election. And so between the backroom negotiations, investigating the fraud itself or the reports of fraud, and then being appointed as a member of this unprecedented body to essentially vote with only 15 people on who would be the next president, Garfield plays this vital and I'd say more comprehensive role in the settlement of this crisis than anybody else involved. And its relevance of that crisis today is obviously incredibly obvious, I'd say. But the Electoral Count Act of 1887 gets passed a decade and a bit after that. And what it does was it clarifies a lot of the constitutional ambiguities that emerged in the election of 1876. And part of that is setting the date for the certification of, or the certification of the Electoral College results for January 6th. It clarifies that the vice president the vice president, shall count the votes as opposed to determine what votes count. And it clarifies to what extent members of Congress can interrupt the proceedings. So that ends up being a very prophetic piece of legislation. And when it was signed, the editorial coverage of the time was, when I was reading it, I couldn't help but, again, think of current times. And there's a quote that I used in the book from the San Francisco Examiner, which says, should another presidential crisis fall upon this country, this legislation will become incredibly pertinent to solving it. And that was a completely correct prediction.
Absolutely. And my jaw dropped when I got to that part.
Oh, it's absurd.
I couldn't believe it.
Oh, yeah, it was absurd. It's one of those moments that make you think somebody might be writing this somewhere. Yeah.
As we talk about presidential nominations, can you talk a little bit about Garfield's nomination in Chicago, and did anything stand out to you?
Yes. What stood out to me was Garfield's own position on whether he wanted the presidency or not. By that point in his life and in the life of the Republican Party, the presidency that resulted from that electoral crisis of 1876 was the presidency of Rutherford Hayes. And it was essentially crippled from the very beginning, both by the context in which it started and, the perceived fraudulent results resulted in Rutherford having to go by Rutherfraud B. Hayes throughout his presidency. So, quite an interesting pun. But then also by the way that Hayes conducted his presidency with his own party, he ended up being privy to the fracturing of the Republican Party under his reign. So all of these factions of Republicans suddenly emerged. So by the time of the nomination of the next president or the next presidential candidate from the party in 1880, the Republican Party was torn between these different blocks. And in one corner, and I'm describing it kind of like a boxing match, you have the stalwarts. And this is what they called themselves. And the stalwarts called themselves that because they identified as the true Republicans, the unapologetic Republicans. And they were devoted to putting Ulysses Grant back in the presidency again for a third term. And they wanted to do that because, one, they liked his policies, especially regarding the South, but two, they believed that he would let them personally profit off of their office, that he would be very good for their own personal wealth and political security. The stalwarts were called the corruptionists because they were seen as the machine politicians who were very comfortable rigging elections, of personally profiting from their public office, and who were unapologetic about abusing their public authority to enrich themselves personally and to enrich their cronies. So they were the crony faction of the Republican Party, or at least that's how they're popularly understood. And in the other corner were another faction called the half-breeds, which is an absurd name, but they were called that because the stalwarts perceived them as being not real Republicans. And then separate from the half-breeds and the stalwarts were these reformers who wanted to clean up government, who wanted to create professional rules for office holders in the federal government. So they wanted to reform government in a way that would take away the stalwarts and the half-breeds' power and create norms and standards for how public officers can conduct themselves and ethics rules that they should stand by and things like that. All of these factions had their own candidates for the presidency. Garfield was not one of them. Garfield was pretty much the last influential Republican who was not in any of those blocks. He was somebody who everybody thought fairly well of and who was obsessed, and from their perspective, with keeping everybody happy. And that made him both a figure of appreciation, but also a little bit of disdain. They all said the same thing about him, which is interesting. The same insult got cycled about Garfield throughout that time, which is he's a man without moral backbone. Because by that point in his career, he had lost the radicalism of his early congressional career. He was then seen as this moderate, pathologically reasonable person who really seemed to define his personal political position by what would be the best thing to what he defined himself by holding the middle ground. So the perception was that he didn't really have any consistent beliefs. And he was also the minority leader of the House. So he really, uniquely among Republicans of that time, didn't have any reason to play factional politics. He just wanted his caucus to stay united. And that aligned very well with his personality by that time, that because he was friendly with everybody. He was the last agreeable man left in Washington. And you read that in his writings, that he was very heartbroken with how the party and then the political establishment of the country entirely seemed to be falling apart. It seemed to be spiraling in a way that was destructive to the policy aims and the common interests of all Americans. So Garfield is in the convention hall in Chicago as a floor manager for another candidate. He had been roped into this political deal to support a reformer candidate. But in the lead up to the convention, people had approached him privately, and they'd said, look, the party is not going to be able to elect a stalwart or a half-breed or a reformer they're not going to give any of those people a nomination. The declared candidates are all too divisive to win a majority of party support. You are the last person who could possibly hold that role. You're the only unifying candidate we have. It's probable that you're going to be the nominee there instead. And Garfield had responded to those overtures with great trepidation. He was genuinely afraid of being given the presidency because by that point in his career, he'd gone through 4 presidential administrations, all of which had started very positively and had ended pretty much on bad terms in a variety of ways. From Lincoln to Hayes, those are not positive ends to administrations. And so he saw it as he saw being president as actually being the end of his productivity as a statesman. And he actually has this very interesting piece of writing after these people are telling him that he might be the next presidential candidate. He says, I hope it is not the case. I would be so dismayed if it was. There is too much work in me left to take that role. So he saw it as kind of the end of his political relevance becoming president and the end of his ability to be useful to the American people. And then second, he was very afraid of considering on a personal level that the presidency might be afraid of him because he thought it was actually, it boded poorly for his ability to be, he thought essentially doom lay there. He had been in Washington long enough where he had seen multiple friends and mentors from James Blaine to Salmon Chase, all decide one day that they could be president. And then they would run for the presidency. And that ended up actually being very bad for their public reputation, their political careers. As soon as, in Garfield's view, somebody in Washington decided they could be president, they immediately became less productive, less good, less effective as a statesman. And he saw this happen so many times with his friends that he named it the presidential fever. And he referred to it over and over again, the presidential fever being this infectious disease around Washington that would contaminate useful statesmen and make them useless. So he vowed in his diary, I will never let the presidential fever infect me. And then all of a sudden, circumstances align where he's on the floor of the Republican convention, and partially by his design, and then partially by chance, he ends up having the bad fortune of saying the right thing in the right place at the right time throughout this multi-day affair. And so circumstances and his own curiosity about the role, because he was still somewhat interested in the presidency, they aligned to make him the next nominee. And when the party gets divided and all of this deadlock has happened on the convention floor, Garfield gets thrown very ostensibly against his will. He makes a big show of trying to resist the nomination and trying to not look interested on the floor. He gets forced into being his party's candidate for the presidency. And so that was very interesting to me, and something that accentuated all of this, because he's that narrative that I just presented. It's based on his writings. It's based on what people are writing about him. This happens, and this is what drew me in, very publicly. The arena for the convention was a public event, and it was held in this building in Chicago that was called the Glass Palace. It was this giant, sparkling, not quite dome, but structure made out of glass and metal, in which there was this arena in the middle where the convention delegates were meeting, and they were sometimes fighting, they were sometimes shouting, and there were frequent speeches where they were hashing out who would be the next champion of the Republican Party. And they're doing that in this sunken arena, in this glass dome, surrounded by members of the viewing public. So it was this, what you have on top of all these political dynamics is this bizarre case of like public gladiatorial political kabuki theater. And it's kind of the perfect political environment, and you to write about, because the drama is all there. And when Garfield gives a speech, I have quotes from women in the audience saying, "Oh, isn't he handsome? I bet he's better looking than that man." And it's just it's so addictive to write about and very fun, and that made it kind of a dream to pull all together. And when you're throwing into that a man who is about to be forced into the presidency that he's afraid of, and where you have factional politics and all of these very colorfully named blocks just fighting with each other, from a writing perspective, that's ideal. So that was very fun.
And speaking of all of those blocks that get him elected or nominated, I found the end of your biography absolutely riveting in its politic that President Garfield is having after he gets elected, that he's having to juggle with so many competing factions. How was he able to deal with that?
Yes, well, I'd say he did the very best he could. And because there was no person who was better positioned in the Republican Party at that time to balance all of those factions. The way he was able to ride them into the presidency during the campaign was essentially by extending a series of deals to the different factions. For the reformers, he promised that he would tighten up regulations on how members of the federal bureaucracy could wield their power. So that was that was one set of circumstances he was able to navigate pretty well. He had been somewhat of a reformer during his congressional tenure, so he convinced that bloc that he was secretly on their side. The half-breeds, he was very good friends with a lot of the leading half-breeds, particularly James Blaine, who was not a lifelong, but a politically lifelong friend of his. And so he was able to convince Blaine, or honestly, let Blaine convince him that the half-breeds were his friends. And then the real trouble in the campaign and then to the presidency were the stalwarts, because the stalwarts were the ones who were most chagrined coming out of the presidential convention. They were the ones who didn't trust Garfield the most. And they were the ones who also, just from a pure power perspective, were, in theory, the easiest to buy off, because the stalwarts, their central motivating goal was influence and power. They wanted public positions in the federal government that they could then use to give money and influence to their cronies. They wanted to control parts of the American political machine. And so Garfield was able to broker a series of deals with the stalwarts over the course of his campaign. Now, when the presidency fell into his lap, even as president-elect, all of a sudden, all of these people came calling, and he could not satisfy all of them. And a series of ambiguities in the deals he had struck during the political campaign, they all came up. They were all called up for due. And Garfield was surprised with how much the stalwarts were asking for. And he was surprised also that his vice president, Chester Arthur, who was a stalwart, was also part of that lobbying effort. So his tenure was defined pretty much from the beginning with this power struggle that kicked off in the Republican Party. And all of a sudden, all of these sleeping dogs of the political system, the role of political appointment in the federal bureaucracy, the state of things between the factions, it all came up. And not only that, actually, the balance of power between the presidency and the Senate, because the stalwarts were very strong influences in the Senate. All of that came up essentially out of the ground. And so Garfield was immediately forced into the position where he had to settle all of these things in this power struggle with the stalwarts. And he hated it. He hated being in that position. He wrote during his time during this fight, I love to deal with doctrine and events. The contests of men and about men I greatly dislike. So again, it goes back to that cerebral character of his. But he ends up fighting these appointment battles with the stalwarts, and he ends up winning. But in his attempt to keep the peace, in his attempt to broker a united Republican Party, and his failure to do so, since the stalwarts ended up rebelling against him, it resulted in his assassination. The rhetoric, the heat of the political moment in that time, it inspired somebody who was sympathetic to the stalwarts to shoot Garfield in a train station in downtown DC. And at the scene of the assassination, or the shooting, I should say, the assassin shouted, "I am a stalwart, and now Arthur will be president." His vision was that Arthur would be so grateful for being given the presidency, because Vice President Arthur was bound to inherit the presidency, that President Arthur would give the assassin whatever job in the public apparatus the assassin wanted. And Garfield didn't die immediately. He died of infection that took 80 days to run its course. But it was this explosive and very tragic end to what was a very compelling, again, I think the most compelling political arc of certainly that century of American history. And it ended, I think, in a very poetic way. This was somebody who was afraid at the end of the day of being in the White House and what that would mean for his political future, his personal health. And he ended up being entirely right. And that really stuck out to me. But when it came time, I knew when it was time to end the book. And that was because on his deathbed in Elberon, New Jersey, because he was moved to the seaside for his health, Garfield was approached the day before he died by a friend of his. He called his friend over, and he asked this friend, will my name have a place in history? And the friend says, you mustn't talk like that, because those are the words of a dying man. You have so much before you, but yes, you have earned a place. And then Garfield looks up and says, okay, well then my work is done. And when your subject says, my work is done, after a lifetime of incredibly hard work and noble work, for the most part, as an author, you just have to lay the pen down. And so that he made it very easy in his writing, even then, for me to walk away at the right time.
What a certainly compelling end to read. And Mr. Goodyear, thank you so much for joining us in this very special episode of War of the Rebellion. Thank you so much for taking the time to write this brilliant biography. And by the time I got to the end, I was heartbroken thinking of the world that could have been with a maybe an 8-year President Garfield. By the which is also how I know a biography is well written, when I become so attached to the main characters within the story. I couldn't get over it. I absolutely loved it. Thank you so much. I will leave you with the last word. Is there anything that you would like the audience to know, upcoming work about this, or say when this wonderful biography will be released and where they could pick up a copy?
Sure. Well, I just want to say thank you very much for the kind words. It was my pleasure to write this thing, and I'm glad you enjoyed it so much. Let's see. I think so. The book is now it's coming out July 4th, which is an appropriate and apt date for a presidential biography to hit the stands. And it's actually available for pre-order now through every major retailer. So you can go to your preferred place to buy books, and you'll be able to get it. And upcoming work, I'll be doing a tour in July. Those are available on my Instagram page at CW Goodyear. So I'd hope to see people there if that's all possible. I'll be going through the DC, New York, and then Ohio areas. So, we're going to make a swing around the circle, as they say. So I'd love to see as many people there as possible. Well,
excellent. And that was the last word, everyone. Thank you for listening, and stay safe, and we'll see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.
John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, while weep the sons of bondage whom he ventured all to save. But though he sleeps, his life was lost while struggling for the slave. His soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, for his soul is marching on. John Brown was a hero, undaunted, true and brave, and Kansas knew his valor when he fought her rights to save. And now, though the grass grows green above his grave, his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, for his soul is marching on. He captured Harper's Ferry with his 19 men so few, and frightened old Virginia till she trembled through and through. They hung him for a traitor, themselves a traitorous crew, but his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah, for his soul is marching on. John Brown was John the Baptist, of the Christ we are to see. Christ, who of the bondman shall the liberator be. And soon throughout the sunny South the slaves shall all be free, for his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. to view on the army of the Union with its flag red, white, and blue. And heaven shall sing with anthems o'er the deed they mean to do, for his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. For his soul is marching on. Ye soldiers of freedom, then strike while strike ye may, the death blow of oppression in a better time and way. The dawn of old John Brown has brightened in the day, and his soul is marching